caterer tonight was Abe Levy from We thank Teresa, our wait staff, for doing a wonderful job for us. There are a few people that I need to thank for making this evening possible. And in no particular order, Liz Gordon, who is our go-between between the shul and our caterers, and for making sure that we have a wonderful menu and that everybody is fed well. So thank you, Liz. And Lila Littman in the main office for putting up with us and for all of our changes and everything. So we really appreciate what she does. I want to thank particularly today Murray and Ruthie Miskin, who were here today to help out, and Debbie Cherniak and Morton Gelber, who came at 2:30 to help with the setup. We certainly couldn't have done it without you. And of course, we want to thank our sponsors, Leah and Steve Roth, for making tonight possible. And if you really enjoyed tonight, in 2 weeks we're having another event. And if you want to sponsor that one, please feel free to see Paul Foreman. And lastly, I want to thank Paul for allowing me to go over budget. And they're not saying anything.
Taking it out of your height.
Thank you. So I appreciate that very much. And we thank you all for coming out here. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the rabbi.
Buenas noches, señoras y señoras. La primera cosa que creo que decir es muchas gracias a Alan Zuck, para todos. Es una noche que es perfecta, y también si los colores que tenemos acá es rojo y amarillo. Rojo y amarillo, amarillo.
Sí, muy
Verde, no, pero en España, de España, los colores.
Sí, muy bien.
Okay, the colors of the flag of Spain are red and yellow. And if you look at the colors that we have for dinner tonight, so that was another wonderful detail there. That we do thank Alan. Okay, so we do thank you indeed. In the summer of 1979, we spent it in Israel. We spent the summer in Israel. And we went for a few days to northern Israel, to a magnificent kibbutz by the name of Kibbutz Lavi. Many of us have some incredible memories from Kibbutz Lavi. And as my mother is checking out, we were enjoying our last few moments on the kibbutz. A tour bus pulls up, and one of the representatives of the tour group comes to the front desk as my mother is dealing with the bill, and asks them if they have tours of the kibbutz. And the kibbutz and the fellow by the desk responded, yes, we do have tours. And then came the next question, do you have tour guides in Spanish? And the fellow looked at him and said, no, we don't have anyone who is familiar with the kibbutz that speaks Spanish. My mother pops in and she says, wait a second, I can offer you a tour guide, someone that is familiar with the grounds of the kibbutz and speaks Spanish. I have a 9-year-old son here, and he would be more than happy to take you around. So the next thing I know is my mother comes to me and says, "Oh, I have something for you to do. You're going to be leading a tour of 45 people around the kibbutz and telling them a little bit about the kibbutz. Don't worry about it, just go," and obviously in Spanish. Now, we lived in Mexico at the time, so this was no challenge. I have no doubt that my Spanish as a 9-year-old was better than my Spanish today. And I begin the process of giving, I take them to the kibbutz synagogue, the kibbutz synagogue. And when we were back there a few years ago, so back in Kibbutz Levi 2.5 years ago, to walk into the synagogue and to stand there where a few years ago I led a tour to some committed Roman Catholics was quite impressive. So I'm giving them a little bit of a description of the tribes of Israel and where the Torah is, and I think it was more of a tour of the synagogue itself. And this group from Bilbao, they were very kind, they were very complimentary, and one of the women comes over to me and she asks me, "¿Qué le gustas?" Like, what do you enjoy? Do you collect anything? I said, "Yeah, I actually collect coins at the time." "Good, so what's your address? What else do you like? Do you like soccer?" I said, yeah, I like soccer. "Fine." And this woman, by the name of Pilar Maria Escudero Lozoya, no joke. So that was the short version. I think. Yeah. So Pilar Maria Escudero Lozoya said, I will send you things. And lo and behold, a few months later, we got a package with coins from Spain. A year in 1982, the World Cup was in Spain, right? Who won then? Italy won, I think. So you're supposed to know these things. So I got these posters and these towels, everything about España of 1982. So we kept up for many years with Pilar Escudero Lozoya, and when we moved to Israel about it was a few years later, she came to visit. She came to visit, and we had a relationship with her. We haven't, I don't know, I can't give you the latest, even though I did look up today as I was thinking about the class a little bit. I looked up and I did find a phone number in Bilbao. But there's a relationship that we have with Spain, that I have with Spain, I think that all of us have really with Spain itself. So our topic today is a little bit about Spain, and obviously a specific Purim, or an issue that they dealt with on Purim, leading to Purim in Spain. You know, there is often, we have this attitude that challenges that we deal with, we view them as new. We have never dealt with this before. There was never such a problem. Right? The decline in society, the lack of morality was never, so this is the first time in history. And Shlomo HaMelech tells us, "Yesh davar she'yomar re'eh ze chadashu." It's new, never happened before. Kvar haya le'olamim. You know what? It happened before. Never forget the story. There was a specific yeshiva in the Midwest. True story. A yeshiva in the Midwest, where there was a son of the Rosh Yeshiva who served as a spiritual supervisor, a mashgiach. And there was some writing on the wall in one of the rooms, one of the classrooms. And this was something that he felt is not appropriate, that is wrong, and he gave a talk where he mentioned that no student should ever do such a thing. It is unheard of. It never happened before. To write on the wall, unacceptable. A year later, the yeshiva was doing construction, and in the old section of the Bet Midrash, they had to remove some panels. And they were removing panels, and lo and behold, what did they find from the early 60s? Some graffiti. And then they found a signature there of obviously of a young student at the time in the early 1960s, with initials he wrote Sam K. They did a little bit of more research, and it happened to be the mashgiach who gave the talk. Never occurred before. So there are things we say they never happened in the past. These are new challenges, unheard of. But the truth is, study history and you realize that history repeats itself. Now, when we talk about interaction with the nations, when we talk about engagement with the nations, when we talk about the fact that cultures affect one another. We are affected by the culture that surrounds us. It's a fact. Some of us recognize it. Some of us are more comfortable denying it. I had a friend who loved sharing the story that when he was studying in the yeshiva in Israel, he was interacting with a Hasidic kid. So the Hasidic kid was telling him that we are much better, the Hasidim, because we do not speak Ivrit. We only speak the holy language of Yiddish, and we keep away from the modern language of Ivrit. So this yeshiva bacher, standing with this cute kid, points to a street light, and he asks him, "Tell me, how do you say this in Yiddish?" And he said to him, "This is a ramzor." It's a ramzor. Now, ramzor is obviously in Hebrew, but for this young kid, it must be Yiddish because we are speaking it. This is what in our communities we call it a ramzor. This must be a Yiddish word. So when the bacher told him, "You should know that it's Hebrew," he was not willing to accept. He felt that it is impossible. So now, quite often, language is an indication of where a society is holding. And therefore, every Shabbat I feel extremely uncomfortable when I get up and I'm supposed to speak here in English. And I remember the words of the Chatam Sofer, right? That it is extremely problematic for a rabbi to get up and speak in the vernacular, right? That's not the Jewish way of doing things. Language, right? Obviously, the times, they are a-changing, right? As the good Yiddish boy Zimmerman has taught us, which is Bob Dylan, for those. So, the fact is that language is often that indication of a crisis that we are dealing with. How to address, how to accept, how much to use the language. So, we're going to start with the 19th century, early 19th century, where great rabbinic authorities are challenged with a very serious issue. And that is, there was a desire in the second decade of the 19th century to make some adjustments to the synagogue. Adjustments to the synagogue. The main adjustment that they were addressing was to start davening, that prayers should be in the vernacular, in German. Okay, the Hamburg Temple you've heard of 1818. And they addressed the question to the great rabbinic authorities like the Chatam Sofer and others. And the reason he struggled with the issue is because the Talmud tells us straight out, Tfilah bechol lashon. You could pray to the Almighty in all languages. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has what's known as Google Translate. And therefore, if you turn to him in any of all languages, Rabbanu Shalom has the technology to go ahead and understand it. Rabbanu Shalom hears Tfilas Kol Peh. So obviously in our tradition, all languages are acceptable. So why not bring into the synagogue those languages which will assist the community in understanding what they are requesting and using that as a form of communication? Chatam Sofer was uncomfortable with it, obviously. And what he tried to argue was the following, that you should know. Yes, perhaps for the individual it is acceptable to pray in tefillah, that's in a foreign language. Perhaps for the individual standing in the synagogue, he could turn to the German or to the English. But in his words, likvoa bikviut, to go ahead and establish on a permanent basis where you have a shaliach tzibur, where you have the chazan, where you have the leader, in leading the congregation in a foreign language, efshar b'shum ofen, that is something that is not acceptable. So this was a challenge that existed. It's interesting for me now to sit and look back at the literature of 200 years ago and see how they dealt with the issue, right? Now, what I do find is that there was a mechanism that was used by great rabbinic authorities to defend the old, right? To withstand challenge, withstand those who want to make those adjustments. And what they do is what's known as the mysticism card, meaning you go ahead and say, we can change things because Kabbalistically, the impact you're going to have in the spiritual realm will be diminished if you go ahead and make the changes. In other words, Great rabbis like Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Margaliot, great rabbinic authority, passed away 1826, and he is the one that writes that you should know that when you pray in Hebrew and you use the words that were designed by the members of the Great Assembly, you are touching upon the spiritual realm. You are entering into a realm of Sodot Ne'elamot. So therefore, you cannot tamper, you cannot adjust, you cannot translate, because you're going to go ahead and not succeed in the mystical realm. So there was a mechanism that was used, a mechanism to protect the old. And this is not just in prayer. There are many, many areas that there are times that to preserve Judaism, to be sure that it is around for the next generation, there are things that you have to bring into the picture. It's a must. There are those that are the traditionalists who are trying to protect the old, use what is known as the Kabbalah card. Kabbalistically, you can't do it, we're not going to make the change. So this seems to be something that appears an idea or a way to deal with the challenge that makes its appearance in the beginning of the 19th century. But obviously, it is not the case. So we're going to go ahead and welcome everyone into Spain. Let's visit Spain. And obviously, what I'm trying to do is to show you that many of these modern day, and I can use the term modern day over the past 200 years, issues already existed in the past. Now, Spain itself, the history of Spain, we're not going to touch upon everything. But if you want to understand the beginning of the attitude that exists in Spain, you have to start with the Muslims. You have to. And when you talk about the Muslims, you have to start with 7-Eleven. Now, not because many of the 7-Elevens in in North America are run by Muslims, but rather because the Muslims conquered Spain in the year 7-Eleven. And I think you're going to remember that, right? Year 7-Eleven. Now, the year 7-Eleven, they are conquering. It was already a Christian Spain at the time. It was a process from the barbaric Visigoths that were there, but nevertheless, Islam makes its appearance there, and the population and the followers of Islam grow tremendously. And believe it or not, or it is something that we are familiar with, this wasn't such a bad time. And it was far better if you lived in the 10th century. If you want to live somewhere as a Jew, the best place to live is in Spain. The golden age. The Muslims were more tolerant. There was an acceptance of other cultures. There was, you had the ability as a Jew to practice your religion. Jews, like the great Shmuel Anakid, reached heights politically that no one can imagine anywhere else, for sure not in France, and for sure not in barbaric Germany or in other areas, and not in Italy, and not in the Middle East, and not in Iraq. Spain was that place, and you got to give credit to the attitude that the Muslims had during that period of time. Now, obviously there is a decline, and this significant period to be mindful is in the 13th century. The fall of Cordoba in 1236, when the Muslims lose it to the Christians. So you always had a little bit of the Christians to the north, the Muslims who invaded from Morocco from the south. They conquer the whole peninsula in the 8th century, and throughout the 13th century they are losing it to the north, who split between 2 or 3 kingdoms, and eventually by the end of the 13th century, with the fall of Seville in 1248, you really can say that the era of Islam controlling Spain comes to an end. They still have a presence in Granada in the south, but nevertheless, there is a shift that's occurring. This is no longer Muslim Spain, but now it is Christian Spain. But nevertheless, there are things from the old that remained. You know, it's interesting. You visit Florida, right? You're Jewish? So you've been to Florida. Look around at the architecture of Florida. The architecture of old Florida. Things that you'll see a lot of tile work. Is that a correct statement? Where does that originate from? Where does that originate?
Spain.
Spain. Spain. So you're sitting there in some nice hotel jacuzzi there, and you look at the tiles around, and you're enjoying the weather, and you look at the tiles, and you think to yourself, we are here because, yes, this is land that was purchased from the Spaniards in the beginning of the 19th century. Spain, where did they get this tradition of tile work? From the Muslims. Muslims who wanted to avoid icons and images of, obviously, of people and even of animals. Tile work was very popular. When the Christians take over, they retain part of the culture, retain part of the attitude as well, as we shall see, and therefore you could think of the Islamic effect on the architecture that appears in South Florida. So something interesting to be mindful of next winter when you make your visit there. Now, with that, the tolerance that existed towards the Jewish people does not vanish overnight. There is a decline, obviously. There is a decline. And the decline starts the process of reaching its peak in 1391. 1391, there is a monk in Seville, and his name is Martinez. He wasn't a pitcher for the Mets, but rather he was a monk in Seville. And they set the Jewish quarter on fire, killed 5,000 Jews, and that is the beginning of that round of the people who have to conceal their Judaism. Publicly they are acting like Christians. Quietly they keep their Jewish identity. As a result, you deal with the issue of the conversos, and the many, many issues that we talk about Spain. It all starts in 1391. Spain, when we talk about Spain, everyone is familiar with the year 1492, but the Inquisition does not begin in 1492, but rather begins 100 years earlier, when the Christians are struggling with the fact that they have these quote-unquote new Christians, but deep down they feel their commitment is not to what Christianity is about, but to their old faith of Judaism. It reaches its peak, obviously. The Tsarists and the Jews are 1480, where you have Ferdinand and Isabella. Jews expelled in 1492. They make their way to Portugal, make their way to the whole world, and the rest we are very, very familiar with. But what we're going to do now is talk a little bit about a period when it is Christian Spain, but nevertheless you will sense, at least from what is discussed regarding the Purim issue, and you will go ahead and see that this is a very interesting era. Now, to begin our discussion, we have to introduce ourselves to a very significant halachic authority. His name is Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet, last name was Perfet. In halachic literature, he is known as the Rivash, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet. Very, very significant authority. Born in 1326, leaves Spain in 1391, no coincidence there. 1391 is a time when many, many Jews fled, makes his way to North Africa, the beginning of a very strong presence of Sfarad Jewry in North Africa, and dies in Algiers in 1408. Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet, the Rivash, is quoted dozens of times by great halachic authorities like the Bet Yosef, and I should say really hundreds of times, and he is an authority that is taken into consideration due to his greatness and due to the fact that he followed a very prestigious school in Spain. Now, when we talk about a prestigious school in Spain, there is a name you have to remember, very familiar one, the Ramban, obviously, Nachmanides. Just when you meet a Lithuanian Jew, the Lithuanian Jew will take great pride in the fact that he is either a descendant of the Gaon of Vilna, like Ken Kantorovich is a descendant of the Gaon of Vilna, or someone that is a descendant of someone that saw the Gaon of Vilna, or someone that is a descendant of someone who practiced like the Gaon of Vilna. Everyone is trying to find their link to the Gaon of Vilna. That's how it works with the Lithuanian Jews. Among Hungarian Jews, I'll be careful, don't worry. Among Hungarian Jews, and especially the Hungarian Jews that are more to the west side of Hungary, not Eastern Hungarians like most people here, but rather moving towards Austria more. For them, that relationship is the Khatam Sofer. The joke is that there was a museum of Hungarian jewelry, And in the museum, in one room, there was a Jew standing there, and under him there was a sign that said that this Hungarian Jew is the only Jew who is not related to the Chatam Sofer. Because every Hungarian Jew somehow is related to the Chatam Sofer. So every Jew, every community finds this hero that really becomes the symbol and the identity of their movement. Now, in Spain, there is no question that Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachmanides, who lives in Spain in the 13th century, who leads the most prestigious yeshiva, who has this significant disputation with the Christians in 1263, and eventually has to leave, who makes his way to Yerushalayim in 1267, and comes to the city and realizes that there is no synagogue in Yerushalayim, and there were only 2 Jews there left in the city, who probably were not talking to one another. And he goes ahead and he establishes a synagogue there, which according to tradition remains the Bet Knesset HaRamban. Nachmanides is that significant authority in Spain. Everything in Spain, any halachic issue, for the next 2-3 centuries, is always addressed as what would Ramban Nachmanides say. So he is that authority. Now, being mindful of that, we could go ahead and introduce here a specific issue that was addressed by the Rivash. And this specific issue will tell you a little bit about the culture of the people in Spain during the 14th century, and we're talking about before the tragic events of 1391. It will tell you a little bit also about the Kabbalah mechanism. You know, it's interesting that there is, you have here a population in Spain. Many Jews who are educated, many Jews who are in business, and thus they are interacting with society. So obviously, there are going to be issues where the rabbis feel we have to defend tradition, right? People are becoming very rational, because that's the way of thinking in Spain in 13th, 14th century. So what do? How do you combat this rational attitude, which could be very dangerous to preserve the Judaism? Because if you're rational, there is always that concern that you might make some adjustments. What comes into the picture? Kabbalah. And it's quite fascinating that towards the end of the 13th century, the great Kabbalists make their appearance there. The Zohar HaKadosh, the text, the Bible of the Kabbalists, makes its appearance towards the end of the 13th century. And Nachmanides, right, who's a traditionalist, obviously is a great Kabbalist, because that is a tool to preserve the old. And what's interesting is that Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet himself, who obviously had a tremendous amount of respect and reverence to the great Ramban, who was no longer alive already for 100 years, who was a disciple of this school that followed the teachings of the Ramban, nevertheless knows, in the name of his teacher, that you should know Ramban, he relied too much on Chokhmat Kabbalah. He relied on it too much. Meaning you see there the tension that the next generation looks back and says they were making Kabbalah into everything. So there was like a pushback. And I think, by the way, if I look at today, and if one day someone's going to write a dissertation about the last 25 years, there is that level of pushback as well. When I would say in the 1960s and 70s or 80s, in many, many yeshivot, there was an interest in Kabbalistic writings and teachings. And therefore works like of Rabbi Dessler or of Gedalia Sher, great Lithuanian thinkers who were impacted by the Kabbalistic Hasidic writings. That was the urge and that was the interest during that period of time, even when I went to yeshiva. Now suddenly in the yeshivas there's much more of an interest in the more rational teachings. There's more of an interest in Rambam, Maimonides. There's that pushback always, right? That things are not going to be exactly the same. But the bottom line is I have to share with you the Purim story, because that's what you're here for. You are here to hear about the Purim issue that will indicate the struggles that existed there. So what we're going to do is, here we go, we're going to visit the community of Saragossa. Have you been to Saragossa? Most of you've been. Okay. Saragossa is placed between, if you drive from Barcelona to Bilbao and visit Pilar, Maria Escudero, Zoya, there's the Guggenheim Museum there if you go, maybe the show, yeah, I haven't been there, some pictures. So if you drive, you're going to hit Saragossa. Saragossa had a very significant Jewish community, very well respected Jewish community. And in the year 1372, our great Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Sheshet becomes the rabbi there. And he obviously is still communicating with his yeshiva and with his teachers, but he is the rabbi of Saragossa. And now comes Purim that year, and he is informed that there's a very fascinating practice that exists in the community. And the practice is that they had a reading there, mainly it seems to be for women, where they would have a Megillah reading in Spanish. All in Spanish. And they would read it from a Megillat Esther, written on parchment, with ink, by a sofer, in Espanol. That was a practice that existed. And he comes, the yeshiva student comes, didn't see it in his yeshiva, and he looks at this issue and he says, this is unbelievable. This is unacceptable. It wasn't done like that in my yeshiva. And he tries to stop the minhag. And he writes to his master, how should I deal with the issue? Now, there were some local authorities there. And he shares with us the names of these other rabbis, like Rabbi Yosef ben David, or Don Ezra. And Don Ezra and others say to him, you have a problem with it? So you have a problem. You have no right to change a minhag that exists here. It's a minhag. It's been done already for many years. You could have problems from today to tomorrow. Minhagim are not changed. He was struggling with the issue. And he writes a letter to his master. How do we address the issue? Now, the truth is, if you start going through rabbinic text, any halachic issue starts off with a quote from the Talmud. The Talmud tells us that you should know Megillah Nikret B'Lashon HaKodesh. However, if you have a community that are lo'azim, the Talmud tells us, if you have a community where people speak a foreign language, and it seems to be that they are not familiar with the Hebrew language, Korinota lelo'azot, it is 100% permissible, says the Talmud, to read it in a foreign language. That's what the Talmud says. So he was addressing this major problem because he did not see it in his yeshiva, but at the same time the Talmud gives its stamp of approval. Now, nevertheless, comes the great Ramban. And remember, this is a very significant authority. This is the Ramban. And the Ramban tells us that you should know, if you want to have a proper reading in Espanol, in Spanish, that's fine. But you cannot fulfill the mitzvah if you are familiar with Hebrew. So it has to be that everyone in the room who wants to be yotze with their Spanish reading has to not understand Hebrew. And also, this is a crucial point, and also the individual who is leading, who is reading, he too should have no knowledge of Hebrew. Because if he has knowledge of Hebrew, so technically speaking, he cannot fulfill his obligation in Spanish. If he cannot fulfill his obligation, he cannot do the reading for the others. That is what Ramban writes. Fascinating. Now, based on that, Rivash comes back to the community, and he says, we have the work of Ramban. Right, we all know Ramban was the greatest of all. We all have portraits, obviously, of the Ramban in our homes. Ramban says that this is problematic. Now, they respond that if you look carefully in the works of Ramban, you'll realize that he himself indicates that it was nevertheless done. Because Ramban writes that even though I have found a technical issue with a reading in a foreign language, a technical issue with the reading in Spanish, nevertheless, Nachmanides, Ramban writes, Ubeharbe mekomot besfarad ta'u beze. In many places in Spain, they made a mistake with this. In other words, they allowed public readings even though the people reading it actually were familiar with Hebrew. So therefore they turn back to Rivash and they say, you see from Ramban that this was already done in the past. It's an old minhag, so you cannot change it. So this was the fascinating debate that he dealt with. And it gives you a picture of what is occurring there. A culture where the average person is very, very familiar with Spanish, not with Hebrew. The idea that you could have a public Spanish reading. The halachic authority who is trying to protect the old, or what he envisioned as the old because it was not done in his yeshiva, confronting the modern people, right? The modern crowd who wants to have it in a foreign language. So this is a little bit of a flavor of the issues that existed there. Now, there's one other issue that they point out relates that there is a problem with the reading in Spanish. You know, in Israel when I was a child. So on Yom Ha'atzmaut in Israel, among the many festivities, they had good TV programs in Israel. And they would show an Israeli movie on TV. Now remember, this is Israel, early 1980s, no cable, one channel that during the year would have educational programming from like 8 a.m., nothing before 8 a.m. obviously. They had those lines. I remember looking at those lines for many hours. You know, the green, the black, orange. You know, that's the image that I have from childhood. So there's one channel, and you sit there. If you're sick at home, you turn on the TV. You wait there for 8 a.m. and 8 a.m. starts the Televizia Chinuchit, it was called, where they had educational. They would have math. They would have English. They would have a Talmud class on the one channel, a Talmud class. You can find it on YouTube. And that would continue until 4:30. And then they would have late afternoon some Arabic programming. And then I think there would be like 1 hour of the garbage TV, which we were waiting for from 5:30 to 6:30. And then for adults from 8 to 9, they would have Benson, I remember. And, these were the popular that they would get recycled programs from the United States 3 years after they got out of circulation there. And then they would have the Mabat. So a movie on TV was unheard of, but Yom Ha'atzmaut is a time to celebrate, so you have a movie on TV. So we waited for Yom Ha'atzmaut for the movie. So they would have classic Israeli movies like Salah Shabbati, as you all remember. And one of them is a cult classic there called Givat Chalfon. Speak to any Israeli, Givat Chalfon, and they'll be shining. Oh, okay. So Givat Chalfon is a comedy. It's looking back at it. I saw some time ago a few clips. I realized it was actually brilliant. And to the extent I do remember, and you'll forgive me, especially the Israelis will forgive me if I mess it up a little bit, there was a situation that you had a group of soldiers by the Egyptian border. Their job was to protect the state of Israel. A few yards down the road you have the United Nations, and then you had on the other side the Egyptians. And one of their chevra, one of the fellows of the Israeli soldiers, and again this is a comedy, he by mistake lands up on the Egyptian side. And they have to somehow rescue him. And it's a big to-do, so they decided that what they're going to do is that they're going to paint their Jeep white, they're going to paint themselves all white, and get dressed up like members of the United Nations. So that was the shtick. So they get dressed up and they paint their car. But the classic image that every Israeli knows is that when they had to put the letters that symbolize the United Nations on the front of the Jeep, right? So they wanted to put the letters that indicate that this is a Jeep that belongs to the Umot Me'uchadot. So they put the UM for, and they drive into Egypt with the UM on the truck, and that's what they do. So this is the image that exists. So there often are issues that relate to translation. And this was the problem that the master of Rivash, a rabbi by the name of Rabbeinu Nissim, tells him the following, that you should know. I believe that there is another significant issue with the translation. And that is that there are 3 words, or 2 words in the Megillah that we are not sure how to translate. What are those words? And the Talmud itself indicates that we don't really know what these words mean. So we are talking, in the section of the Megillah that talks about the fact that they sent out messengers throughout the kingdom to inform them all about the first decree and then later on the second decree. So it tells us that you should know that the Ashtranim, Bnei HaRemachim, were sent. You've heard this before. Believe me, you've heard this before. What are the Ashranim Bnei Ramachim? These are words that obviously originate in Persian, and we don't know what they are. So therefore, the master of Rivash says to him, listen, I looked at the Megillah that was translated into Spain, and they translated as Los Potros Fijos de las Eguas. That helped you a lot, aren't you, right? Los Potros Fijos de las Eguas. Now, Potros are young horses. Eguas are the mares. So it seems to me that they translated these words as the young horses that were sent out. But he himself says that this translation perhaps is problematic because it makes more sense that we are not dealing here with a mare, but probably with a mule. So they start getting into the nitty-gritty about translation. And he himself, Rivash notes that this seems to be more of an issue, how to translate these specific words. So this is the Purim story that relates to a public reading in a country where the public believed that this is their country, this is their language, we should be familiar with the culture. Unfortunately, history has taught us that when indeed languages are important, and indeed being loyal and thankful to a country that hosts us is important, the reality is that there's only one language we're always going to have. You know, my Zayden, my grandfather used to say, he asked me, I remember, what is the most important language in the world? So I said English, which wasn't nice, because my Saba didn't speak English. And he said, no, the most important language in the world is Yiddish. Why? Because you'll find a Jew anywhere that speaks Yiddish. Now, this is an attitude that existed, with all due respect, 60 years ago, right? 60 years ago, everyone spoke Yiddish, right? You tell me, do you see the level of knowledge in Yiddish when you compare? Many of you could remember some fine Yidden from 45, 50 years ago in the synagogue. Is Yiddish in decline in societies you interact with? Right? In general, it's hard to say that. It's hard to say. It is in decline unless you live in Williamsburg, right? Or in Monroe. Then you could go ahead but that's a different approach. But the people we interact with, the one language that does remain, and we've gone through Spain, and we've gone through Poland and Germany, there's one language that is our language, and that's Hebrew. And as we talk about these issues that address our destiny, we have to remember that Hebrew is indeed the language of our identity. And it brings me happiness to see that we are in a rebound era. You know, when we've talked over the past few days about the halachic issues of the expanding Yerushalayim. We've been discussing it often here, that as you all know, walled cities from the days of Yoshua ben Nun, read on the 15. What city does that relate to? Yerushalayim. It relates to Yerushalayim, but the suburbs of Yerushalayim. And the halachic authorities over the past 100 and something years are addressing new neighborhoods that are part of the new Yerushalayim. Are they still considered part of the old city? And thus you read on the 15th, or perhaps not. And this, for me, is the most uplifting section in Jewish law, because it's talking about a comeback. When so much of Jewish literature talks about decline, about pogroms, about tragedies, so much of European history, when I talk about the history of the Jews or issues in Poland, so many of them are depressing, about cemeteries that were taken away or Jews that were expelled, dealing with issues of Old Sefer Torah. And here we are dealing, Purim is that opportunity to realize that a nation, we are a rebounding nation. When you see what's happening in Israel, we are experiencing an incredible time with the Hebrew language coming back to life, right? That there's communication in Hebrew. It is our language. All these discussions are interesting. All these discussions that we have about Spain in the 14th or Europe in the 19th are interesting. But what we have to remember is, bottom line is that these authorities were protecting the language of our identity. We are experiencing good times. So with these positive words, I hope first of all, we're thankful to all tonight. We're thankful especially to the sponsors, to Steve, and to Leah, and to Gravity, and to Leah Roth. It is sponsored to commemorate the yahrzeit of Leah's father, Leah Slomovitz, and Yom Tov Lipa Ben Eliezer. The yahrzeit after Purim, right? After Purim, right? So Neshama Sharav Aliyah, we're thankful. And it's an opportunity for me to wish everyone here amazing Purim, an uplifting Purim, a time of celebration and appreciation for our survival, right? We are around, there have been so many challenges, and you hear about challenges, we have overcome those challenges, we are around to celebrate, so this is the beginning of the official celebration. We thank everyone, we thank Alan especially, we thank everyone that participated, and may we continue celebrating until the complete redemption. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
Amen.